curator.
How are you?
Very
Thank you
well.
for coming.
I'm delighted to be able to do this. Yes, it's so wonderful that you've got so many important people on your panel. Well done.
No, but it's important I think, because there's a crisis in Central America that no one sees, only UNHCR.
And now Venezuela is going.
It's growing. According to UNHCR, it has 17% of the cases.
How this works?
And do you have a script?
you're doing the introduction now, and then we're moving to the general debate. Okay? And this is the full scenario.
Oh, okay.
Okay, for after the general
Okay.
debate.
How this works?
I think it works.
Hello, dear colleagues. ¿Sí se oye?
That's correct. That one's correct, yes. Okay.
We are about to start our assembly. Please, dear colleagues, take your seats. Thank you. Director General of the International Organization for Migration, Ambassador William Lacy Swing. High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Zein Rad Al Hussein. High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi. IPU Secretary General, Mr. Martin Shungon. Honorable speakers of parliaments, members of parliament, special guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is both an honor and a high responsibility for me to address this assembly here today for the first time in my capacity as IPU president. I cannot tell you how delighted I am to be presiding over an assembly that has chosen to debate the pressing topic of migration as the theme of a general debate. This is a topic that is very close to my heart, as you can imagine. As a Mexican, I have witnessed first-hand family tragedies and dramas unfold as people have to flee both from my country and neighboring Central American nations to reach the land of opportunity further north in pursuit of their dreams and a better life, if not for themselves, for their children. Dramas such as the Brian Soler, an Honduran child who left his country in 2014, carrying only a couple of hundred lempiras, around $9, he got by selling a rabbit he himself hunted in the rural outskirts of Tegucigalpa. After losing his only cash to some smugglers in Guatemala, Brian had to swim across the Suchiate River into Mexico at midnight in order to avoid being spotted by both local gangs and Guatemalan and Mexican immigration authorities. Later on, Brian hopped on board the infamous cargo train La Bestia, a traditional means of transportation for non-authorized migrants traveling to the US-Mexico border. It is common knowledge among migrants that you board La Bestia alive. You disembarked a mummy. On board, Brian had to swatch unspeakable things, things that no human being should have to see during his lifetime. Pregnant mothers losing their babies after falling into the tracks. Girls of his age, maybe even friends or relatives, being sexually assaulted by groups of human traffickers that hunt a route all the times. Forceful recruitment by vicious drug cartels. In one word, ultra-violence. Yet, a broken childhood is still worth the risk, not only for Brian, but for thousands of Mexican and Central American children whose sole aspiration is to be able to financially assist their parents, left back in their countries, to some extent to have the chance of fleeing a generalized situation of violence. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to acknowledge the presence of the chief of the 3 UN agencies I singled out in my salutations, from IOM, OHA, the High Commissioner Office for Human Rights, and UNHCR. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be today with us. We look forward to a fruitful interaction with you later this morning and the possibility learning from your valuable insights. Later today, we will also have the privilege of listening to the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, during an interactive session, and the Director General of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. 2018 is the year for migration and refugees, if ever there was one. This is the year when the two global compacts, one on migration and the other on refugees, will be adopted by the global community. As acknowledged by the UN, human rights-based approach to the governance of international migration is one of the most demanding tests of global cooperation in our time. With an estimated figure of almost 260 million international migrants worldwide, a 49% increase in comparison with the year 2000, our world is becoming a world of migrants. Even though most of these people migrates in order or in legal fashion, it is no secret that there are still millions of people which recur to migration out of necessity through forcible displacement. As of today, there is an estimated of 50 million, 20% of the international migrant population, people that are under irregular migratory status. It seems highly probable that we might reach or even surpass the historical peak of almost 1,500 recorded migrant deaths of 2016. Therefore, the advancements of international community in the building of an inclusive international framework of cooperation to curb these trends, it is of the utmost urgency. Fellow parliamentarians, more specifically, our general debate during this assembly will identify ways to strengthen the global regime for migrants and refugees through evidence-based policy solutions. As policymakers, we are duty-bound to devise laws and policy based on evidence, not on political party affiliation or political persuasion. The 22.5 million refugees around the world, and most comprehensively, the 65.6 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, are not only people in need of assistance, they are also agents of change both in their home and recipient countries. Hence, I urge you to enhance in fruitful discussions to take away concrete recommendations from the outcome document we will adopt at the end of the workshops that we have organized on refugee protection and state asylum systems. You will no doubt have noticed a big tent pitched outside the reception area of this conference center. That is a real refugee tent that UNHCR helped us to bring here. And we did that because we would like you to feel, to think, to live kind of an experience of being maybe for a few seconds the experience of a refugee. I therefore invite you to make your way to the tent and to imagine just for a little while what it must be like for men, women, and children to live there for months, sometimes years, with little or no privacy. Please take a moment, go to the tent, try to get a seat, maybe try to rest for a minute, and try to imagine what might be to be a refugee. Here is located at this convention center in Geneva. But try to imagine that tent in the middle of very difficult climate conditions. Try to imagine the conditions that people might be facing in their own countries to choose better to live in a tent. We also have an exhibit. Samuel Turpin allowed IPU for free to have this exhibit on migration and climate change. Also, take an opportunity to see these pictures. These photos are really eloquent. I urge you to acknowledge that we have the power, as members of Parliament, to turn the tide. As a starting point, we should stop considering migration as a problem. Let us think of as both a challenge and an opportunity for all parts involved. Let us identify the drivers of migration, look back at historical trends and to see how we can manage this phenomenon in a more human and fair manner. Let us try and make the crossing safer, protect the most vulnerable of migrants, women and children, and let us try to make the enormous potential and pool of talent of migrants bring to us and put those to the benefit of our societies. We also need not only to take an important work during this assembly, we also need to consider to change the narratives, the speeches that many times are having in some countries. A lot of this depends on changing mentalities so that our constituents regard migrants as fellow human beings and not as foreigners coming to steal their jobs and life or welfare. An opinion sadly shared by the main political leaders of some great powers in the world, it is high time to debunk the myths and dispel all of the misconceptions surrounding migrants and refugees. Only then can we formulate sound and balanced national migration policies or adapt the ones we already have. Using populist slogans and policies, almost on the verge of xenophobic or hate speech, is a cheap trick used by some politicians to garner votes. Let allow ourselves to build bridges, never to build more walls between our countries. Let us be the place for dialogue. Let us parliaments to be the opportunity that millions of people are desperately seeking in order to save their lives. I appeal to your humanity to not give into such tactics. We all have a moral compass within us, and I call upon to you to follow yours. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you fruitful deliberation and concrete outcomes that we can take back home with us to our respective countries and leave behind as a tangible legacy. Make no mistake, we are in a very important moment for all humanity. The global compacts on migration and refugees are a great opportunity for change, for giving humanity a chance to remember that we all are brothers and sisters, to remind us that we can all be in the same situation. High Commissioners, Director General, this is a very important IPU Assembly. We are reaching very important assistance. You are going to have here 69 speakers, 149 countries represented with their delegations. We are also having here one of the most important attendance for an IPU Assembly. Almost 1,500 people are here as parliamentarians, as staff, as organizations and NGOs. This is a very important moment for us. We know that you are making a huge effort to make these global compacts a reality, that you are making a huge and important work to make human rights a reality. Allow us as parliamentarians to be part of that important duty. We are responsible in our countries for ratification processes. We are also responsible of delivering national laws respecting and promoting human rights. We are responsible of having priorities well reflected into budgets and to ask our governments for accountabilities. Parliamentarians can be a very important hand for change. We are here committed with our minds, our hands, and our souls to make this world a better one. Let's change the world. It will start from our communities. Thank you very much. I will give the floor to our moderator and our wonderful guests here. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you very much. My name is Claire Doole and I'm the moderator, and I'm extremely honored to have the heads of IOM, UNHCR, OHCHR and the president of the IPU to, as President Cuevas has said, this is one of the most pressing issues of our time. And we will allow time at the end for you to ask some questions, because this is obviously a very good opportunity for you to raise your voice. First of all, President Cuevas, I can see from your speech with those shocking statistics and the passion in your voice, this is something that you take to heart, and it's very important for the IPU to be involved in this debate.
Yes, as I just said, IPU has been addressing these challenges on migration and refugees at the IHL committee, also during our assemblies, annual hearings, resolutions. So we are looking forward to have the participations of our High Commissioners, Director General, and we're very pleased to be here and to do everything in our hands to make this global compact a reality.
Thank you very much. And perhaps if I start with the Director General of the IOM, because we've seen that there are current challenges in the way we manage migration. So, sir, could you please tell us, how do you see these current challenges?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, dear Gabriela, dear Martin. It's a great honor to be with you, and I wish to congratulate you on your selection of the theme of migrants and refugees. Let me make, I think that we all need to spend much more time with you, the parliamentarians, listening to you and trying to dialogue on these important questions. Let me make a couple of points. First of all, we live in a world on the move. There have never been as many people migrating as we have today. Most of them are moving very smoothly and very easily, but as our Secretary General has said, he's a migrant too. He said, I am a migrant, but I didn't have to take a rickety boat across the Mediterranean or hide in the back of a truck to cross the frontier. I came, like most people, very smoothly from one country to another. Now, unfortunately, there are also more forced migrants than at any other time since the Second World War, at least. The President gave you the figure, 65.6 million, which is from our traditional partner, UNHCR. I think it's valid. It's increasing every day. But I can tell you that the drivers of forced migration are such that migration is going to remain a mega trend of our time. 1 billion of our 7 billion world are migrants. 1 out of every 7 of us a migrant. My own family is scattered across 4 continents, and I think that's more the rule than the exception today. The driving forces are many. We have at least 9 or 10 armed conflicts from the western bulge of Africa to the Bay of Bengal. We live in this arc of instability and sorrow. We have no promise of a short to medium-term solution to any of these. We have climate change that's becoming a major driver. We have the demand for labor. We have the demographic divide between a global south with a median age of about 15 and a global north with a median age of about 50. Mass youth unemployment, an aging north in need of jobs and skills, a youthful south largely unemployed. These are all driving forces, and that will continue. I think that it's also safe to say that you, the parliamentarians, you have in your hands at least 3 powers that allow you to be a positive force with regard to the forced migration. First of all, you have the power of policy. The power of policy is one, to come up with a comprehensive approach to migration and refugees. You have the legislative authority to enact laws. You have the authority to create more legal pathways for people to migrate, to get to the jobs that are there, and to provide the skills that are needed. You have the power of policy to ensure that integration is a success. Most of the bad things that have happened in recent days, the last year at least, have all been the results of failed integration. These are not migrants who arrived yesterday. They are citizens who feel alienated. You have the power to enact anti-trafficking laws. You have the power to decriminalize irregular migrants. You have the power to give migrants access to public services. You can say they're coming to take advantage of our public services, but you can also say it is in our national interest to have healthy migrants and educated migrant children. And you have the power to be involved with and to support the Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. Secondly, you have the power of parlance. People take their cues from you. What you are saying on the public record determines whether or not they're going to be anti-migrant, anti-refugee, xenophobic or not. They need to hear from you that migration historically has always been overwhelmingly positive. Most of our countries were built on the backs of migrants and with their brains. It continues to be the case today. They're only 3.5% of the world's population, but they are producing 9% of global wealth measured in GDP terms. 50% of all the CEOs in Forbes magazine are children of migrants or migrants themselves. Finally, you have the power of the purse. You have policy, you have parlance, and you have the power of the purse. You can determine how much money is allotted to integration policy, to fill the challenges that are out there for that, and to give people access to services. I would conclude by saying migration is not a problem to be solved. It is a human reality as old as humankind, and it is our responsibility to learn to manage it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, and indeed for being so concise on the responsibilities of parliamentarians, as you say, the power of policy, parlance, and purpose. You mentioned the Global Compact. Given these great challenges, what sort of Global Compact would you like to see? In a few words, please.
We have many, many people who are on the move who do not qualify for formal protection under the 1951 Geneva Convention. These are increasingly women. About 50% of all migrants moving are women, not just going to join a spouse, but many of them pursuing a professional career. These people need some form of protection. You have victims of trafficking. You have people going to join their family. You have many, many unaccompanied minors who are simply seeking work. If you look in Libya, most of the people traversing Libya across the Mediterranean are unemployed young males seeking work. They all need assistance and protection. They're not criminals. They've done nothing wrong. They simply are looking for a better life.
We've already mentioned, of course, the role of the UN Refugee Agency. You have a 1951 convention protecting refugees. High Commissioner, if you can tell us, why is the Global Compact so important for you?
Well, let me join Bill in thanking the Inter-Parliamentary Union for having us here today, in particular President Cuevas and the Secretary General, and all of you. Why is it important? Well, for a number of reasons. You've heard about the large number of people on the move. A sizable portion of those people are refugees, people that move not of their own choice, but because they're forced to move and cannot return to their countries, at least during the time of their exile, because they would be at risk of their lives sometimes, and certainly because they have lost the protection of their states. We estimate this population as being close to 70 million, a number that has no precedent in our own statistics for the past few decades. Refugees are staying in exile for longer and longer time. There's many estimates for that, 15 to 20 years in average, so a whole generation. As Ambassador Swing already said, flows are increasingly mixed and more complex to handle. So for all these reasons, two compacts are extremely timely and useful. We also should dispel the notion that this is a crisis that affects the rich countries. This is what has been conveyed in the past few years, especially when many people arrived in Europe. 86% of the refugees and displaced people are in middle income or low income countries. So it's really also a problem of resources for those countries. We should dispel the notion that people are mostly in camps. Most of the refugees are in cities, in fact, increasingly, mixed with the local communities. And this generates challenges of its own. There's many, many good examples of how host countries, often with limited resources, are taking in many refugees and adopting very open policies. I can think of Iran and Pakistan in respect of Afghan refugees, or Bangladesh for refugees from Myanmar, or Uganda for refugees from all neighboring countries, Ecuador, refugees from Colombia. I can give you a long list. I wouldn't do justice to all those who are enacting very progressive policies, but we also see rising exclusion, which is sometimes physical exclusion, confining people in closed camps. We see legislative restrictions rising all over the world, and including in the global north. And we see the practice of refoulement, pushing people, deporting people back to dangerous situations also rising. So to discuss and establish a compact is very important, and I would even say urgent. It is not an opportunity to put on the table the fundamental principles enshrined not only, by the way, in the 1951 Convention, but in many other regional instruments that even go beyond the remit of the 1951 Convention and cover many categories of people at risk. But it is an opportunity to discuss how this responsibility, which is an international responsibility, is actually shared in practice. This is what the Global Compact on Refugees wishes to do. And I think, and I conclude, and I speak here to you as members of your respective parliaments, it is perhaps an opportunity, or surely an opportunity, to reflect on this worrying phenomenon that has already been mentioned by President Cuevas and by Ambassador Swing, of politicization of the refugee, of the migrant, of the foreigner. President Cuevas said it's a cheap response, and I would agree. And especially in the case of refugees, accused of stealing jobs or bringing insecurity or threatening values, when these are people that are fleeing very often from life-threatening situations. So it's an opportunity both in your legislative work, but more importantly, in your political work and in your political discourse to redress this situation and emphasize the responsibility that we have to save lives and provide protection to people that have been deprived of the latter, and also to find solutions to their displacement in a principled and determined manner.
Thank you, High Commissioner. And you mentioned that there are 2 global compacts. Very briefly, are they linked? What are the links between them as you see?
Of course, these are 2 distinct compacts because refugees are a very specific group of people that flee for specific reasons, and they are distinct from migrants. Also, one should not forget that the international body of law concerning refugees is highly developed, more than on the migrant side. So the two compacts start from a different legal foundation, but evidently there are many points of contact. Many of these people face the same risks if you think of trafficking, of smuggling. So we will have to look at where the synergies are, where the cross-references are, and we are doing it with our colleagues working on the Global Compact on Migration, so that there is coherence, consistency, and mutual reinforcement between these 2 instruments.
Coherence and consistency, very important with these 2 global compacts, Director General.
Absolutely, and this is why the High Commissioner and I and our teams are working very closely together. In fact, the High Commissioner let me have one person full-time in an office in his building in order to ensure that continuity. As the High Commissioner said, refugees have a much more solid legislative background, not just the 51 Convention, but elsewhere, whereas migrants is something new territory. In fact, on the September 19th, 2016 was the first time that heads of state had ever come together at the General Assembly to discuss the question of migrants as such. So it's a really new territory, and we're making sure that the 2 work in the interest of both groups.
High Commissioner for Human Rights, let me bring you into this discussion. We've heard the statistics, we've heard that there's more people on the move than ever before. They're some of the most vulnerable populations. What challenges are we facing today in terms of defending their human rights and protecting and promoting their human rights?
Thank you very much, Claire. Good morning or good after morning to all of you. Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, my dear colleagues from the UN. All people on the move are entitled to their rights, irrespective of nationality or their place of origin. At a time when we see chauvinistic nationalisms on the rise and this preoccupation with the control of borders, having listened to Filippo, Grandi and Bill Swing, one wonders how it is that those countries that have accepted large numbers of refugees, as Filippo just mentioned, view those countries that say that we must control our borders. We must pay attention to who's coming across, lest there be extremist elements, those who will us ill. And there seems to be creeping into the narrative a mean-spiritedness, a meanness in the way that we are governing our affairs. And it's not something that I think can be sustainable, not for our children or their children, not for the future of the planet. And we have to make a decision: do we leave behind what it was that we constructed after the Second World War? and delve deeper into sealing our countries, sealing our minds, if you will, first, before we seal our countries. If we were to improve the lot of everyone, we have to begin by ensuring protection for those who are most vulnerable. Avoid abuses such as the criminalization of irregular migrants. Avoid detention for children. Detention should be an absolute last resort, not a first resort, which is what we see in many countries. We need to avoid collective pushbacks, which Filippo spoke of, or refoulement to countries obviously not safe. And we need to develop further, of course, avenues, as was just said, to ensure legal migration. It struck me, and some of us were in Davos at the beginning of the year, that one of the most important people in Davos, the CEO of the major, or let's say one of the major research artificial intelligence companies, is the son of a Syrian taxi driver. And this particular individual will be guiding much of where the planet goes on artificial intelligence, and yet his family in many contexts would not have been received. And so it belies almost any sense of wisdom that we continue on this trajectory toward a more mean-spirited world. It is important that we abide by principles and guidelines. Earlier this month, the delegation of Mexico at the Human Rights Council, together with 15 other countries, welcomed the principles and guidelines on for human rights protection of migrants in vulnerable situations produced by my office, and I ask all the parliamentarians here gathered to have a look at that and to join us in a social media campaign to stand up for the rights of migrants. It's a hashtag Stand Up for Migrants. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now, I know that you're very actively involved in the ongoing consultations for these compacts. So a round of very quick-fire questions. If I start with the Director General of IOM, what do you see at the moment as the biggest challenge in the current consultations on your compact?
I think the biggest challenge right now is to decide what happens after we have a global compact. It will be at that point a document, a consensus document. But the question is, how do you carry those commitments forward? Number one, you will need a review conference, a review process every 3 to 4 years, simply to say, how are we doing? Are fewer people dying in the Mediterranean and on the US-Mexican border? Are there fewer victims of trafficking? Have we prosecuted any major smugglers, etc.? Secondly, you will need to have a capacity building element because some countries will sign up and make commitments for which they really don't have the capacity. And thirdly, we need to keep the dialogue going on those issues that cannot be solved right now. For example, and this is my last point, how do you resolve the conundrum between our European friends who want to make more returns of migrants and south of the border, Africans who want to have more legal pathways to Europe? That has to be addressed, and I hope it'll make it into the compact. If it doesn't, we need to continue the dialogue.
Indeed, it's not just when things are decided at an international level, they have to be translated, of course, into national policy. High Commissioner, if I can ask you for your biggest challenge as you see at the moment with the current consultations on your compact.
I think the challenges mirror very much those that Bill Swing just mentioned. Fundamentally, you have different constituencies discussing the compact with different agendas, and But this is why the UN exists, to try and bring those agendas together. In the case of refugees, it is the agenda of the countries hosting large numbers of refugees, and the agenda of the countries that are more donor countries. We have an ambition somehow through this process to overcome this dichotomy, donors on one side, hosts on the other, and try to bring all together around a sense of shared responsibility, in which everybody plays a role, evidently. And through this, I think we need to encourage other forms of cooperation. Resettlement, unfortunately, resettlement is declining. Resettlement meaning moving refugees from one country to the other. The numbers are declining when they should be increasing, especially around the compact process. But also scholarships, training schemes, humanitarian visas, other forms of legal pathways for refugees from the poorer countries to the countries with more resources. We are trying to find ways in the compact to institutionalize more, without making it binding, of course, but to create a more of a sense, as I said, of shared commitments around this issue, which, as we have seen in Europe a few years ago, is of concern really globally to everybody.
Thank you. Indeed, these recurring issues of burden sharing and collective responsibility. High Commissioner for Human Rights, what are you seeing as the biggest challenge as these consultations go forward?
Well, the biggest challenge is fairly obvious. There is one delegation in particular articulating a position that diversity is a threat, migration is not to be encouraged, and the delegation is very vocal about this, but I'm sure this opinion is shared by other countries that don't speak out in that way. We obviously disagree with this because this way of thinking will lead to catastrophe and almost lead to humanity if it is unchecked. We therefore argue very strongly that if you seek protections for your own people, you must seek protections for everyone. We are one global community. The pursuit of the thinnest agenda means scrambling it up for everyone. This is the lesson of history. We've learned it time and again. And unless we absorb this basic point, we are going to be in difficulty. The proliferation of a thought that diversity is to be eschewed and that intolerance should infect our way of thinking needs a more robust response, not just from governments, but from parliaments the world over. And I think this is clearly the major threat affecting the compact, but it's not just the compact, affecting the globe altogether.
Thank you very much for those words of warning. Perhaps if I can just redirect a question, are we seeing any hopes for optimism or innovative solutions coming out of these consultations, High Commissioner?
Well, it's the point I think that has to be raised, and was raised in this morning's presentations, is a very small percentage of the world's population is actually moving. So if we're talking about 3 to 5%, as compared to tourism, where you have over 1.1 billion who travel every year to other destinations, we have a mass hysteria, a psychosis, a drive toward the most extremist thinking on the basis of 3 to 5% of people moving around the planet. And if that isn't somehow unhinged thinking, I don't know what is. And so we must put it in proportion to what the scale of the challenge is, and opening up legal pathways is the way to do it. Certainly fueling hatred and poisonous rhetoric of that sort is clearly not a way that we should be doing business. Alas, There are many politicians who do engage in it, and that this has to be controlled. Otherwise, of course, the peril facing all of us is extreme.
Thank you very much. High Commissioner for Refugees, are you seeing any innovative solutions, working with the private sector, local communities, anything that we can hold on to as optimism that things are going to change and we're not going to head for catastrophe, as the High Commissioner for Human Rights has just outlined?
Yes, and I think these aspects, these innovative aspects, concern an important element of this whole situation. As I said earlier, this is not a crisis for the rich world. This is a crisis that affects mostly countries that have few resources. And therefore, the instruments that we must develop more are in support of those countries in particular. Where I draw some encouragement is from, for example, the involvement of institutions like the World Bank or the bilateral development cooperation bodies that have never really been involved in refugee responses, because these have always been considered humanitarian situations. Now, if a refugee is in exile for 20 years, clearly she or he cannot be sustained simply with blankets and medicines. You have to give this person an education, you have to provide livelihoods, you have to support the communities hosting them. So the development organizations are coming into this compact very strongly, and I am happy to report that we have strong interest also from the private sector, from civil society, from academia, from cities around the world. And I think that it is important that we see the compact as a whole of society compact, not just a compact between states and international organizations. This is why your own participation, your own interest is vital to the success of this endeavor.
Yes. Director General, where do you draw encouragement from these consultations on the Global Compact?
Well, I draw inspiration from the Global Compact because we've never gotten this far before. We have a commitment by heads of state to negotiate a global compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. To do this, and I leave this as my thoughts for the parliamentarians, and I know that you have it in your hands to make this improvement. Number one, we need your support, even as we go forward with the compact, to start changing the public narrative. It has become toxic. We all know historically that migration has always benefited the country of destination, the country of origin, and the migrants themselves. But what's happening now is we have a poisonous narrative. Number one, it's endangering the lives of migrants. Number two, it's depriving us of their contribution. The sooner they become regularized, the sooner they're going to pay tax and contribute. They will quickly repay the access to public services. Secondly, we have to learn to manage and eventually to embrace diversity. I would not like to ruin your day today, but our view at IOM is that every country in the world virtually is inexorably going to become more multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multilingual. Now, we have a situation where some countries are engaged in a strange kind of irony. They're trying to protect societies that no longer exist. Every country is multicultural and multi-ethnic today. And then finally, we have to have an effort to try to come up with a comprehensive, longer-range policy, not one that is doing band-aids to an issue, but rather is moving beyond the Second World War consular and visa policies that we have to be much more creative and innovative.
Thank you very much. So yes, very clearly your call to parliamentarians, and perhaps if I might just go to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, you're ending your 4-year term this year. What is your message to this Assembly as concerns protecting and defending human rights?
My main concern is that we're seeing the gradual disintegration of world order, the international laws that we've put into place to regulate our behavior, the absence of any common sense when it comes to public discourse for the sake of short-term profit. And really, it's almost a reneging of our duties for future generations. I worry about how we can possibly rebuild that which we are now destroying without facing a cataclysm. These are very serious issues we confront on the human rights side. If we see the most vulnerable, the irregular migrant under attack, with few coming to the individual's defense, you realize that others are equally exposed. Eventually, this cornerstone of international law will be knocked out, and we will again face a condition not too dissimilar of what was faced in previous centuries. Fundamentally, we need law. We as human beings are untrustworthy, we are unreliable, we don't listen, we don't observe our own obligations. We need law to regulate our behavior, and it's too easy to spurn it. So my appeal to all parliaments is you have a critical role in acceding to human rights instruments. These are binding obligations. These obligations fall on the judiciary, on the executive, but also on national assemblies and legislatures, and help us to protect your people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. President Cuevas, at the beginning, you were saying that parliamentarians want to be involved, and you would like to see more of a role of parliamentarians, for example, in the global compacts, that they have more of a role and more involved, as I understand.
Indeed, we need to be part of all this process. Actually, both in Global Compacts, IPU has been represented. We were part of the stock-taking meeting in Puerto Vallarta with IOM and all the organization. Actually, we were represented by a plural delegation from different geopolitical groups at IPU. Also, we participated with UNHCR at a very important meeting in December. So we have been actively participating, but as Director General said, that is not enough. We are going to see 2 global compacts that are going to happen, but we need to understand what's going to be next. And next is going to be the important processes. How are we going to make the changes and improvements into national laws? That is the parliamentarian's responsibility. We also need to understand that the priorities, when they are really priorities, are reflected into budgets, and that's other parliamentarians' responsibility. We need to understand that these xenophobic hate speeches are not a responsible answer to the moments of crisis or the problems that some countries might be facing. That is the cheap exit for irresponsible politicians. We need to understand, as politicians, as parliamentarians, that we represent citizens, but also that we should be the example of taking decisions, of giving speeches, or of having a narrative, first responding to real facts. That's why we chose this general debate issue. We need to take decisions under evidence-based arguments, not only about strong feelings. That is not the responsible answer. We also need to understand that the process of delivering results is yes, at the international level right now, it's going to have a national implementation process, I'm sure, but also at the local communities. If we don't change the realities for inclusion, nothing is going to change around the world.
Thank you very much, President. And of course, I draw your attention to the fact that there's a very strong partnership between the IPU and these agencies, and who have prepared these booklets on human rights, migration and refugees for you. I would now like to open the floor. We most probably have time for about 3 questions. I would kindly like to ask you for questions and to tell me who you would like to answer your question. I see that the lady from Italy has caught our attention, so please, the floor is yours.
My question is to the High Commissioner for Refugees. You said that the content of the Global Compact should not only assess principles, but give direction on how the responsibilities are shared in practice. I couldn't agree more. The problem is that Italy is part of Europe, and Italy is the southern border of Europe. And we have received, for example, in 2016, 180,000 people. Last year, we went down of 1/3. Anyhow, and in Europe, we share rules. But unfortunately, these rules are not implemented, and we have felt we have been left alone, or almost alone, in dealing. All the responsibilities were on our shoulder. So could you consider in the compact ways to really enforce sharing responsibilities? First question. Can I ask for another question? Okay.
We are under time pressure, but thank you very much.
Eh?
I'm sure that the High Commissioner would very much like to answer that question about shared responsibilities under the Global Compact.
Yes, and what you reported about the situation in Italy, your opinion regarding that is very much shared by UNHCR, as we have stated many times. In fact, the point I would like to make here is that Europe, which has traditionally had very advanced systems to provide asylum, to determine who's a refugee, provide asylum, and even to somehow share that responsibility, all these constructions seem to collapse when much larger numbers of people started arriving in 2015. So since then, my predecessor and then myself have been insisting on the need to establish within a political union like the EU, where this decision can be made, doesn't need to go to the General Assembly, some responsibility sharing mechanism, including, for example, through the relocation system that was approved by the EU in 2015, but implemented at less, I think, than 20%. So I think that my message would be Europe is in the lead there. If Europe cannot show to the world that it, as a union, can share responsibility, it will be more difficult for the rest of the world to establish those systems. Through the Global Compact, of course, we're putting forward some very practical suggestions on how to share that responsibility. But once again, that example, and not just in terms of responsibility sharing, also in terms of quality of legislation, of avoiding refoulement. This is where we look at Europe, as we have for many decades, to lead the debate in a positive manner and not to establish negative examples which then countries with far less resources will point at when we're asking them to take even greater responsibility in terms of asylum.
Thank you very much. And I have 3 countries on my list, Kenya, Argentina, and Afghanistan. So I'll be taking, and Venezuela. So I'll be taking questions from those, and then we will be closing the discussion because you will be getting on to your interactive debate. And I know that you're keen to do that. So perhaps if I can hear from Kenya, and who would you like to answer your question? 1 minute.
I would like to ask the High Commissioner for Refugees, but all of them can also respond. My name is Kenneth Lusaka, Speaker of the Senate, Kenya. Noting that Kenya is host to one of the largest and oldest refugee camps in the world, that's Dadaab camp in Garissa, which is 26 years old. Noting that the camp is highly overstretched, as posing overstretched with over 600,000 people against the capacity of 90,000. How can the UHRC assist countries like Kenya, which themselves have limited resources, cope with the increased burden that comes with paying host to a high number of refugees? And also considering the threats that terrorism poses to the whole world, noting that some of the refugee camps have been shown to be incubators or breeding grounds for terrorists. How can UNHCR with the country, work with countries like Kenya so as to ensure that they continue to host refugees without compromising their own national security?
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. Yes, what could you do for Kenya, one of the countries who takes in many refugees?
Yes, I don't want to go into too many details regarding the specific situation mentioned by the speaker, which I'm very familiar with and I have discussed several times with the government of Kenya. But in short, I think the approaches that we are testing, that we are developing in preparation for the Global Compact, in particular, an approach that we call comprehensive refugee response framework. I think there was a workshop here yesterday on this practice and many of you participated. That approach applies very much to Kenya, but also to other countries hosting large numbers of refugees. We are encouraging development organizations with much larger resources to come in support of the response, complementing the humanitarian response, which is fairly limited, investing in all the areas that are impacted by the presence of refugees, environment, for example, infrastructure, public services, especially in protracted situations like the one that was just mentioned. This is one aspect of the Global Compact, if it is institutionalized, that will really be a game changer for large refugee situations in areas deprived of resources and often exposed to climatic hardship.
Thank you. For reasons of time, I'm going to ask for the question from Argentina, followed by Afghanistan and then Venezuela. So if I can ask, first of all, Argentina. I don't hear a question from Argentina, so perhaps if I could have the question from Afghanistan. Oh.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I have a question and a very small intervention. The question is to the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi. Thank you for mentioning Afghanistan and the issue of the crisis of refugees and migration in that country that has suffered 40 years of war and still continue to suffer war. You mentioned about the policy of our neighboring countries, which we do appreciate. I would like to know what would be the UNHCR approach when it comes to forced and massive deportation of refugees, depending on the political mood. The second point, a small intervention both for UN High Commissioner on Refugee, but also for Director General of IOM, which I had the pleasure of meeting in Kabul. is the issue of unaccompanied children with no nationality and women. The immediate intervention to support any refugee would be to provide them with immediate need. But in long term, after 1 year, what happened to those children that need identity and nationality, in the case of Rohingya children especially? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I could ask for the question from Germany.
No. Thank you very much to give us the floor. Just last week, the World Bank published a highly alarming report. In sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia, more than 140 million people could lose their homes by 2050 as a result of water scarcity, crop failure, following storm surges, or the rise in the sea. So this is already the consequences of the climate crisis. That means for millions of people, immeasurable loss of their homes. What is the answer of the international community? What do we give them kind of status? Because I remember that the president of Tuvalu said, we are not refugees. We lost everything. We cannot return home. What would you propose to deal with these terrible consequences of the climate crisis? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, I haven't forgotten Venezuela. So Venezuela, please, your question.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Well, Venezuela has gone from being a receiving country to a sending country in terms of migration, and the High Commissioner for Refugees recently said through his spokesperson that countries should be encouraged to provide a differential treatment to migrants for each country. But our government remains oblivious to the situation of Venezuelans and is not providing any support to this mass movement of migrants, and thousands of Venezuelans are going into Colombia and Brazil in particular every day. The National Assembly has called upon different international agencies to provide for a humanitarian corridor across our borders. So we are available to international agencies, including the Office for the High Commission of Human Rights, the UNHCR, and the IOM, to provide space for developing national policies that meet that objective. And together with these agencies, I hope that we can strengthen the situation and improve the situation for Venezuelans.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to hear from Canada.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Mr. Swing, I have a question for you very directly. I haven't heard any conversation yet this morning about the role of the private sector. I'd like to know what the role of the private sector will be in this compact, how they will be engaged. In a Canadian context, we've always believed that immigration is the lifeblood of our economy, but diversity is now the foundation of our success. How will the private sector be engaged in the compact? And how can we get the private sector the largest source of employment for all migrants? How do we get the private sector to embrace the idea of profiling diversity as an essential prerequisite to success for their operations, domestically, transnationally? For example, recently Microsoft moved 1,000 jobs out of the United States to Canada because of the restrictions on visas imposed by the White House. Microsoft made a very hard, calculating business decision. It did not want to forego on the talent that it might have access to. So a commentary, please, about the role of the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm taking two final questions from Sudan, please, and then we'll go to Bangladesh. So Sudan, what is your question?
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the floor. As parliamentarians, we are delighted to participate in this debate. I have the following question about the reality in the field for many migrants and refugees. Wherever they may be from, in host countries, we'd like to know what measures can be taken, irrespective of any political pressure which is being put on decision makers by many states. Could you describe the situation in the field about the real situation in countries of origin and host countries? Are you free from any political pressure in that respect?
Is from Bangladesh.
My question is, in Bangladesh, you know that we are hosting more than 1 million Rohingya refugees. And these people, we are taking care of them, we are doing our best, and we are thankful to the international community for their support as well. But my question is, how do we make sure that the persecution of the Rohingyas within Myanmar is stopped and that Myanmar is made to repatriate their citizens back in safety, security, and dignity? They must be able to go back to their own homeland, to their own homes. How do we make sure that Myanmar does that as a member of the international community? They must take their people back, and we need support from the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions, and I will now direct some of them to those on the panel who would like to answer them. High Commissioner for Refugees, from Afghanistan there were concerns about forced deportation and unaccompanied children. Yes, please.
Is that all right?
Yes, please do. Please.
Thank you. So I'll reply to some of the questions that I thought were addressing the issue of refugees. And by the way, I think that the fact that you have so many diverse and important questions shows how important it is in your national parliament to discuss these matters which are also of global interest. First of all, to say two general things. Forced returns, refoulement and forced returns are two practices that, of course, are contrary to both to the spirit and the letter of the Refugee Convention, of other instruments, and of international law. So certainly these are practices that we discourage and, if necessary, condemn when they happen. It is also true that there are countries that have hosted refugees for a very, very long time, with declining resources and less international attention and no resolution of the conflict that have provoked those refugees, that have caused the refugee movements. So that needs to be addressed as well. The difficulty is always to support long-term host countries after a number of decades. So all these things have to be balanced, but certainly we would want to discourage always the forced returns. And in terms of political pressure, the Sudan question, well, this is why multilateral organizations like mine and others exist, to somehow constitute a buffer against political pressures that inevitably arise or occur in situation of refugee movement. Refugee situations are humanitarian, but they have profound political dimensions, and therefore political responses are often the instinct. And I think that this is where organizations like mine can filter that and remind of the principles, suggest ways to respond in an effective but principled manner. Quickly, just to say that I agree very much with the statement of the representative of Bangladesh. The return of the Rohingya refugees to Myanmar is a right for those refugees, but can only occur if it is done not only voluntarily, of course, but also in safety and in dignity, meaning that their rights back home have to be re-established or established, and of course then reconstruction and development must also occur. So we are, as you know, engaged in complex discussions on this matter, but we have not yet progressed sufficiently to talk about conditions for return. I would also like to respond to the statement made by the representative of Venezuela to say that, as he mentioned, we have recently appealed for resources to help countries, maybe 15 countries that are hosting an increasing number of Venezuelans leaving the country. We have discussed this matter also with the government of Venezuela, the need to protect and assist Venezuelans across the region. We hope that the reasons for which they're leaving, political and economic reasons, will be addressed so that this increasing exodus, which is worrying us very much, will be ended soon.
High Commissioner, thank you very much. And now let me ask the Director General of the IOM for his responses to the questions from the floor.
First of all, thank you very much. These are excellent questions, and I cannot possibly do justice to them in the time we have available. But I've tried to group under sort of 4 points I'd like to make. Number one, I think we should all get around and support the Secretary General's new prevention agenda. I mentioned the 9 or 10 armed conflicts from West Africa to South Asia. I cannot be convinced that some of these could not have been prevented had we had leadership reacting earlier. South Sudan is a good example of that. I'm not convinced that some of them could not have been prevented had we stayed the course. Libya, another example. So we have to be more serious about prevention. That's for the future. Secondly, I think we have to maintain a degree of perspective, and my colleagues, the two High Commissioners, have given you a lot of perspective this morning. We have never given enough credit to the 6 neighbors of Libya and the 4 neighbors of Syria who have kept their borders open at enormous cost to them economically and politically. The 1.5 million migrants who came north in 2015, 2016 is less than 0.5% of Europe's population. But in the absence of a comprehensive migration and asylum policy, we got what we got, which was a couple of countries that were cooperating and the others basically saying, we don't want any more migrants or refugees. So I think perspective is extremely important. Our colleague from Kenya, who's been hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees for many years, Sudan, Ethiopia, and many other countries, but that just simply happens to be a fact that seems to be forgotten when we talk about the movement of forced migrants. I think the third point I would make is that all of these conflicts are in competition for very scarce but generous donor funding. The High Commissioner for Refugees and I chaired a pledging conference here Friday a week ago to raise $950 million for the Rohingya, about which the minister from Bangladesh asked a very good question just now. $950 million, that is only to get us through December. So we'll be back in October again asking for more money. So clearly the solution is to find how and under what terms could the Rohingya go back to their traditional homes for more than a century in safety, dignity, and sustainable conditions. So that's another one that's going to require our minds on that. Finally, the question on climate change. This is a growing issue. Some of the Pacific Island nations are already buying property in other countries to take their people when the water rises 1 meter. That is adaptation. We have to do more of that to try to be prepared for what is inevitably going to come.
Thank you, sir. And if I can ask the High Commissioner for Human Rights for his observations on what he has heard.
Just a reaction to what was said by the distinguished delegation from Kenya. Of course, every state has an obligation to protect its own people from terrorist activities, and too many states suffer from it. We have to be careful, though, and put it into perspective. Terrorists can create enormous damage to states and to the international community, but very rarely will they break a state. The state will break itself quite easily. The way a state responds to terrorist threats, not least in the way it views migrant and refugee flows, is cardinal and something that has to be stressed time and again. I join my colleagues in hailing the position of Kenya and all the governments that were mentioned here, but many more who have left, not just governments, but states who have left their borders open to refugees and those who are fleeing catastrophe, including from climate change, as was mentioned. We need to keep emphasizing the centrality of human rights. The Universal Periodic Review, which all states are subjected to, puts parliaments and national assemblies in the front row of assuring that states that have accepted their recommendations of others under this peer review system can be monitored, or let's say the executives can be monitored to ensure that these recommendations are then put into place. And this is something that we would appeal to all those gathered here to undertake. But thank you once again for hosting us.
And to conclude this very lively discussion, I'm just going to ask the panelists for their one take-home message. High Commissioner for Refugees, what is the one thing that you would like to say to this distinguished and august audience?
Well, first of all, thank you for taking the time to listen. And when we come and visit your countries, receive us, because we can go more in depth about issues related to your countries. But one message, which has already been expressed, but I want to reiterate it again. Your constituencies have very, very important concerns in terms of employment, in terms of security, in terms of values. And we would never for one moment underestimate the seriousness of those concerns. They have to be addressed. But please resist the facile temptation to address those concerns by shifting the responsibility of those concerns to people that have no responsibility in creating insecurity, unemployment, of a decline in values. Because by doing so, you worsen the situation, you diminish the sense of humanity, which is the fundamental value which brings us all together. Resist that temptation that brings votes, but ultimately leads us to a much worse place than where we are now. Thank you.
Director General of the IOM, one take-home message.
I guess the message I would have would be that large-scale human mobility is inevitable. It's there. It's going to continue, particularly as the world's population moves toward 9 billion near the end of the century. Therefore, we have a responsibility as elected officials. Secondly, large-scale migration is necessary if jobs are to be filled, skills to be available, and economies to flourish, especially given the demographic divide between global north, global south. And finally, large-scale migration is highly desirable if we have policies that are humane, responsible, and in the national interest. And that is why we serve in these positions, all of us. And I would say, therefore, we need now to engage in programs of public education and public information. We cannot be in denial. We must not suffer from refugee amnesia, forgetting that both our organizations, UNHCR and IOM, were founded in 1951 to take Europeans ravaged by the Second World War to safe shores and new lives. We must not suffer from that and manage this issue rather than running away from it. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, High Commissioner for Human Rights.
There's nothing courageous, nothing heroic about exploiting and picking on the weakest among us, as Filippo, Grandi and Bill Swing have said this morning. We need to be a humane world, a generous world, a world where we see kinder politics, not one of division. Many of you have suffered enough from war and catastrophe, if not today in your recent history, or at least in the last 100 years. And I think we need to heed the calls of victims and migrants who feel the enormous pressure and the axe of society fall on them by making them the center of the focused attention, not the consequence of whatever decisions come out of the discussions in New York. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to give the last word to President Cuevas.
I believe, and I think we all believe, in the relevance and the power that IPU has. We are the parliamentarians of almost all the world. We are the voices of millions of people that are believing in us, and they are asking us to change the world, to change the reality that in many cases is really painful. We are having this panel, but we have to live with some clear responsibilities. To follow up about the Global Compact, to give our perspectives, to express our opinions. That's why we had a workshop yesterday with UNHCR. That's why we had also with UN and with IOM the annual hearing in New York. And that's why we are here, because we need to protect human rights of all people. And part of those people are the most vulnerable, migrants and refugees. So if we truly want to be the parliament of the parliamentarians of the world, this is one of the most important challenges that we are going to face. So please, let's do our part. Let's make this follow-up on the Global Compact. Let's start preparing, as Ambassador Lacy said, what's going to be next. I believe that we have to do a lot of homework into national laws, into defending and protecting human rights, and of course, again, we are also responsible of budgets. So please include, even regardless the nationalities, passports, include the most vulnerable people. Those are the ones that are asking for our voices to be raised.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you very much to our distinguished panel. Thank you for your questions, and apologies to those delegations that were unable to ask a question. I know that Malawi wanted to make a point, and Pakistan, and I think we're all aware in this room that Pakistan is one of the countries that takes the largest number of refugees. So with that word, thank you very much for your attention.
And in the name of IPU, I would like to give a very nice gift. It is a plate with the IPU headquarters image. So thank you very much to High Commissioners, Director General. Thank you very much for making this huge effort on Sunday to be with us and to deliver these very important words. Thank you very much.